In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Alrighty, so this is our last session where we'll be talking directly about Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. And if you want a sort of roadmap of what we've been doing, in a lot of ways, Taylor's book is a classic work of philosophy in the sense that it's asking one of the central questions of philosophy, which is, what is good? Or what is the good? Or what is the good life? Philosophy can be broken down into that as one of its most basic components. What's the good life? How are we supposed to live? What is our purpose? To what ends do we move in our life? Is there a purpose to life? All of those things have been charted by Taylor. And the next section that we're going to do, the next 5 to 6 weeks section that we're going to do on Ian McGilchrist's The Matter of Things, is to ask a different question, but no less important: what is true? Or what are the ways to truth? And these are the subtitles of his book, his 2-volume book, The Matter with Things, another ridiculously massive tome that is way beyond my grasp entirely, but we're going to give an effort there. And then the third section is what is beautiful, right? Goodness, truth, and beauty are the basic poles of the ethical life, the basic poles of the philosophical life. And so that's what we're really asking, but we're reading all of these things from a distinctly Orthodox perspective and trying to situate ourselves within this challenging world with a sense of what our perspective is as Orthodox Christians. So what is good? What is the good? Or what is the good life? It used to be that the Christian religion supplied the basic contours of this question to Western society. It no longer does, not on a day-to-day basis, and has not for some time. Taylor's work has been an attempt to answer the question of why that is. What happened that people went from a condition where belief was an impossibility? It simply wasn't an option. It wasn't a conscious sense of, I can choose not to believe, or I can choose not to go to church. In the Middle Ages and everything before then, not an option. How do we go from that to, not only is it an option, but for many people, maybe most people, it's a preferred option. And maybe it's not so reducible to belief, but certainly to the practice of the Christian faith. A lot of people believe in a lot of different things. A lot of people continue to have spirituality. That's part of the Nova effect that Taylor has talked about. But what is the story that helped all of that world unfold? Modernity consists in a change in perspective, in which both individuals and society no longer see themselves in their everyday life as oriented towards a transcendent reality that requires of them a transformation, requires of everyone in that society a transformation. Just read the New Testament if you're not sure that that's true, right? You cannot read the words of Christ without concluding that he is calling us to change. He's calling us to be transformed. The moment we think we've already arrived, we've already stepped out of the mind of Scripture, already stepped out of the mind of the New Testament. We're all called to that, and we're all supposed to be oriented towards that transcendent reality. But now, human flourishing occupies all our attention and energy as the self-evident way things are. That's modernity. That's the secular age, secular to, etc. This is the flattened immanence of our contemporary life. What is the purpose? We live as if there is no meaning to anything, even as we seek to create meaning for ourselves, which has incubated to a point where the pointlessness of it all begins to take center stage for more and more people. And that puts us in a remarkable predicament, no longer having a common vision of the good life, a common vision of a transcendent good life in which everything here is pointing to something beyond itself in eternity, in God, in the Church of Jesus Christ. We end up having a meaningless life, so we make meaning and we chase after our passions, and we all do ourselves. We all do what we want for ourselves, and more people find this immensely unsatisfying. This is not a full life. Not everybody feels that way, and I think it's important to recognize that. Not everybody goes through life and hits a crisis where they decide, boy, I've done it all, I've made the money, I've got the house or houses, I've got the cars and the nice vacations, and I've got it all, but I'm empty. Right? Some people have it all and they just want to enjoy it all, and it never occurs to them that there's anything more to life or more to meaning than that. But for more and more people, there's a realization that the world simply is not satisfying in this flattened, immanent state that we have created for ourselves. It is not reality. It is a construct. It is a way we have chosen to understand our place on earth. It's a way we've chosen to understand our place in the universe, or more specifically in the cosmos, not in a layered, hierarchical, meaningful cosmos that all points to God, but instead a world where we are just floating on a blue dot in the middle of a vast, almost incomprehensible, large, empty space, which has no meaning other than the accident, whether that was the Big Bang or whatever the Big Bang means. That's all sort of up for grabs right now, it seems, as far as how that all worked. So what I want to do tonight is recognize this is the story that Taylor's been telling. This is the moment that we've been brought to. The last section of Taylor's book is in some ways the least directly applicable, I think, to us as an Orthodox Christian audience, mainly because he's really pushing back on secular II fundamentalists, those who want to insist that we really have created a better world by kicking God out of our public spaces, by living in an immanent world where human flourishing is the only thing that really matters. We really have improved everything, and it's just going to get better and better and better and better, right? So Taylor takes the last section to really do almost a kind of an apologetic against that in his own particular way. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I do want to, however, explore a couple of elements in this story that I think are important to our own self-understanding so we can grasp what it is that we are really wrestling with and why. And I hope that that has been the main sort of takeaway for this section of the course. We all should walk away from this. I know I certainly have, challenged to acknowledge that our lives have been sort of wrapped up in this secular mindset far more than we've realized. And that even our approach to faith, even our approach to what it means to be an Orthodox Christian is affected by that, right? We believe differently. This is Taylor's definition of secular III. We believe differently in a disenchanted world. Once we're aware that there's an option to believe something else, or to believe that the world is just matter through and through, reduced to mathematics, nothing beyond itself, that changes everything. And so here's some ways that I think are surprisingly relevant to us. And in some ways, this is a part of the book and a part of the story where he's talking about the age of mobilization. We talked about this a little bit last week. He's talking about a sort of severance in the mind, moving from the medieval mind into the ancient regime and into the age of mobilization. And it went something like this. It used to be understood that discipline, as a word, discipline, was something that originated in faith, and then faith formed the basis for the way that discipline functioned on all other levels of society, work, family, social life, etc. And one of the things that happens, one of the breaks that happens in the secular two world, is we begin to remove faith from our public sphere. We begin to move faith from being the most obvious thing that motivates us to action. And so something very peculiar happens, and we talked about this tension in the Middle Ages, widely acknowledged by many scholars, the tension between I've got to work to make this life livable, but I'm also called this vertical sense of transformation, and that functions in different ways on different people depending on what your place and role in society was. But this was a tension. And one of the characteristics of the modern age is that it wants to resolve and release that tension. And so the Christian disciplines begin to shrink. The idea that civilization depends on Christian living begins to get cut, right? And people no longer see their sense of place in the world as depending upon their sense of place in the church. So the Christian disciplines start to recede. One of the interesting things he talks about in the book is the fact that for a long time in Western civilization, we were able to hold on to the idea of discipline in our work lives long after we lost discipline in our Christian lives, right? Long after we minimized what we were called to by getting rid of that tension and saying, hey, I got better things to do. I don't have time for all that prayer and church and all that stuff, right? I've got money to make. I've got things to produce. Long after that break, we maintained a sense of discipline in our work lives. And this is one of those things that you don't even think about. You think, well, yeah, of course, you have to work, right? But do you? This is sort of an open question now after COVID, and it may not affect any of our lives individually, but the numbers of people that simply never went back to work after COVID are staggering. We all kind of have to wonder, well, how are they living? What are they doing? The number of men who simply don't want to play the game anymore. It's like the gig is up, right? They see through the facade, and the discipline to work is starting to crumble. But Taylor tells this story in such a way that it's interesting. A lot of times people were able to just create this bifurcated idea of discipline in their lives. What do we mean by discipline to work? Self-restraint, right? Self-denial, show up on time, do what you're told, complete your tasks, take responsibility. All of these things used to be understood as dependent upon, in some way, your Christian virtue and your Christian life. That might seem like an odd thing to us. It probably does. We probably never thought of it that way. But you have to remember what Europe came from before Christianity. The idea that there was this self-discipline and this rigid form, and I can, deny myself and do my part, is by no means an automatic human capacity. Sometimes anarchy is more preferable to more people. And sometimes a way of life that's closer to, pure, almost a mix of hunter-gatherer, agrarian, pillage and conquer. There's a sort of discipline to that, but it's a discipline of letting the passions fly. Think of the Vikings and our ideas about the Vikings. You just let it all out there, and there's all these outlets. All of that has to be contained. How do you contain it, right? We assume that it just happened. But there's a story to that. There's a history to that. There's a philosophy behind that. So the decline of this traditional Christian life begins to take root deeper and deeper into European society. And I just want to read a few things here. Here's another aspect of this. The stability of marriage was understood to be essential to social order. The stability of marriage is essential to Christian order. Christians saw their faith to some degree as essential to civilizational order. But this was not the only source of the sexual ethic which has dominated modern Western Christianity. There were also strong images of spirituality which enshrined particular images of sexual purity. I'm shifting gears here into the sexual because it's a big part of the story, particularly when we get into the sexual revolution, which is the final part. You've got the age of mobilization from 1800 to 1960, and then you have essentially an era defined by the sexual revolution. And this is what he says. This all starts to change. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Let me backtrack for a second. He's describing the Catholic Reformation in France. This is after the French Revolution. We can think of the Catholic Reformation, in particular in France, in the terms I have been using in the study, as an attempt to inculcate a deep personal devotion to God through Christ or Mary in potentially everyone. An attempt, moreover, which was to be carried out mainly through the agency of the clergy, who would preach, persuade, cajole, push their charges towards this new higher orientation and away from, this is the key, the traditional community pre-axial forms of the sacred. What does that mean? That in the old world, in the pre-modern world, faith was not understood necessarily as a uniquely individualistic thing. My faith will save me. But rather, our religious life and our sense of having a spirituality was a communal reality. It was a sacramental reality. It was a reality realized with the others, right? There's a shift. And what he's describing that as a push towards deeper levels of piety and devotion to the individual. This culminates in the interesting dynamic of this. It culminates in fear. How do you push people to be more pious? Well, you can either love them incredibly, or you can make them afraid. What if I haven't done enough? And so one of the things that happens in the age of mobilization and sort of leading up to Christianity beginning to retreat from Western society is precisely leaning heavily on threat and fear. If you do not do these things, you will burn in hell for eternity. And you get into the whole culture of fire and brimstone preaching. And one of the things that happens then from this is that we see a paradox, that by calling individuals to piety, we inadvertently, or I shouldn't say we, the Catholics in France, inadvertently create an environment that affects us, in which you have to establish a kind of minimum of, if you've done this, you're okay. Okay? And it's not the thing that you would expect. You would think that if you were establishing a deeper call to piety and devotion to individuals away from the communal and the sacred sort of social order, that you would have more piety. But ironically, you end up with a system in which there are certain basic things you have to do in order to be okay. And this is what emerges as moralism, and this is crucial. Moralism is the crucial importance given to a certain code in our spiritual lives. We should all come closer to God, but a crucial stage on this road has to be the minimal conformity to the code. This is the minimum you have to do to be okay with God and not suffer the hellfire and the brimstone that's set aside for you, right? Without this, you aren't even at the starting line, as it were, this crucial journey. You're not in the game at all. And Taylor recognizes that's a weird way. This does not square with the New Testament. Jesus Christ never says, follow me, or at least do this minimum, and I guarantee you you're okay, right? There's just nothing in the New Testament like that. Instead, it's sell all that you have, give to the poor, and follow me. Whenever there's an obstacle, Christ identifies the thing that needs to be detached from a person in order to more fully unite themselves to himself. So the New Testament doesn't teach this, but this moralistic attitude of, in order to get to the starting line, there's a minimum agreed upon notion of this. And this is where sexuality comes in, because one of the arguments is that the Catholic Church in particular In minimizing the starting line, what they were left with was a holding on to sexuality as a sort of absolute from the Middle Ages, even as they let other things slide. And this then pushes particularly men to begin to retreat from the church, mainly because, he uses this interesting, towards the end of the book, talks about John Stuart Mill exalting the pagan ideal of self-will, let me make sure I'm reading that correctly. Self-assertion, pagan self-assertion is something that John Stuart Mill exalted, and he opposed that to Christian self-denial. Right? Christian self-denial becomes almost entirely defined with sex. All other aspects, all other ascetical practices, those fall by the wayside. As long as you're sexually pure, you're at the starting line, you're okay. And this creates a weird new tension. But notice that the tension is for those who adopted the Enlightenment ideals of pagan self-assertion, and we're beginning to see Christian self-denial as a feminine, and forgive me for this language, but it's kind of the language of history. It's feminine, it's womanly, it's weak, and men should be strong, and they should go and conquer the world. And that's what the Enlightenment was about. That was what the Industrial Revolution was about, right? Don't hold us down. And so then sexual freedom becomes a big part of this as well through urbanization. With urbanization, you see a breakdown of the old agrarian structures of society that made sexual transgression not possible. People had more freedom, and therefore they started to pursue it. And with the church harping on sex, but letting a lot of other things go, it just seemed to be more and more irrelevant to people's lives. So this is one of the arguments that Taylor is making. The other interesting aspect of this is Nietzsche. Like John Stuart Mill, Nietzsche also opposes the Dionysian to the crucifixion, or the crucified one. By Dionysian, we mean, if you saw the Olympic opening ceremony this year, that whole controversy over a Dionysian love feast. That's what they're talking about. So Dionysius was like the god of wine and the god of feasting and the god of orgies. It's a sort of an open celebration of physicality and the enjoyment of physical pleasure. So Nietzsche also opposed the Dionysian to the crucified one, where crucifixion and self-denial are considered these warped ideas of what human life is like. You ought to go and enjoy yourself, right? That's power. That's freedom. And this shapes the world we all live in, absolutely. We can't turn on any form of entertainment on television or streaming service or whatever without seeing this story play out before our eyes in so many different ways. We know that story. The implication is that for modern people, Dionysius or the Dionysian is obviously more attractive. The freedom to do what you want when you want it, okay? So that's all part of this story. And it leads to this fascinating quote. There is a catechism that was in wide use in the 19th century in Roman Catholic France. And there was a woman, Sister Elizabeth Germain, who was sort of analyzing it and describes this about the way Christianity begins to change in that era. Morality takes precedence over everything, and religion becomes its servant. It's a very interesting thing. Morality takes precedence over everything, and religion becomes its servant. Faith and the sacraments are no longer understood as the basis of the moral life, but as duties to be carried out, as truths that we must believe, and as means to help us fulfill these moral obligations. All right? What she's describing then is an upside-down understanding of the religious life. Instead of faith and the sacramental life and worship, liturgy, being for people the foundation from which they then lived a moral life, it was the opposite way. They were simply support beams for living a moral life, and morality was everything. Christianity was reduced to morality. And again, part of the problem was that it openly tolerated all kinds of aggressive behavior and how people like treated their underlings, their employees. There's no consequence for boorish behavior, but God help you if you transgress the sexuality line, you see. And so in Western Europe in particular, there's a lot of pushback on that and a lot of sense of, hey, we have a new freedom now. Who are you to be poking in? Who are you to be butting in? Who are you to be requiring confession and all these sorts of things? And so all of these begins to decline. So this is important because I do think that, you know, for our church in North America, this is part of the backdrop. Christianity becomes a kind of source for moral behavior and civilization. Christianity becomes a source for moral behavior and civilization, or Christianity is a civilizing force. It's no longer the sacramental body of Christ declaring the gospel of Jesus Christ that's so evident in the New Testament. It's the power that makes sure everyone behaves. And that's very easy to rebel against. It's very easy to rebel against that. And this is explicit. I actually heard this in, I was reading something, and this was a long time ago, but it was two Catholic priests, and I think they were actually in France, and they were talking about the difficulty of their pastoral work, and one said to the other, look, the church is here to civilize these people. The church is here to civilize these people, right? People without the church's hand on them will go off and do crazy things. So the church is there to keep everyone in check. But notice that the church now is really the servant of the moral order. It's the handmaid of the civilizational order. It's no longer the gospel of liberation. It's no longer the gospel of new life or transformation. It becomes this straitjacket. And so that's one of the reasons why people begin to rebel against it. But here, it plays this role in Orthodoxy as well in the Western lands. One of the temptations for Orthodoxy is to say, look, here's normal people. You can't require or expect much of them. We're just going to make sure they stay in a kind of moral order and uphold civilizational values. And really, what can ordinary people be expected to do? Just be a good person, come to church, put your money in the plate, you're good, right? That's the minimum. That's exactly what's being described here. How did we go from the religion of the New Testament to come to church, put your money in the plate, be a good moral person? That guarantees you your place in eternal life. That's precisely what he's talking about happening or originating in the Catholic Reformation in France. Does that make sense? When back in Great Lent, I was describing in several homilies that if you pay attention to those homilies that lead up to Great Lent especially, and here let's just talk about the publican and the Pharisee, but in so many, time and time again, when we get to the Sunday, the story is an overturning of the moral order in the other direction, right? The good guy is who? The Pharisee. The bad guy is the publican. But Jesus praises the publican and condemns the Pharisee. And this happens over and over and over and over in the New Testament. It is really the crux of our Lord's own prophetic witness to the world that he found, that people had overturned faith as life and as way of life and as simply accepted a kind of moralism. So you can see where this comes from even deeper. But I know that this was hard for some people. People said to me, Father, your homily really has me confused. Because, isn't it like we go to church because we're the good people? And we're rewarded as the good people for going to church and receiving communion, and we do our part in society, and we do our jobs well, and that's the whole thing, isn't it? I know some of you are squinting like, really? Right. How can you read the New Testament and think that that's what Jesus called us to? And yet, somehow we've absorbed that message, or at least some of us have absorbed that message. And that's the problem. We don't know what the words of Christ himself are, and so we adopt what we find in the environment that we're in, And that moralistic religion as morality and civilizational order sort of takes over. So it's a real problem. And obviously the solution to it is simply open your New Testament. Read the Sermon on the Mount, not just the Beatitudes, but the whole Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7. And my goodness, talk about overturning the whole moral order. Christ does not reduce faith and life in him to just be good people. But that's what we've all heard. And I mentioned this before, this moralistic therapeutic deism is basically the religion of young people today. God made the world. He's far off. He's up there. He's out there beyond the cosmos somewhere. And he's given the world to us. And he just wants you to be a good person. And that's all that can be expected of you. You're supposed to simply make your own meaning and purpose in the world. Again, for a lot of people, that's their reflex of this is what God must want from me. And you can go through life pretty happy that way for some people. But for a growing number of people, there's a realization that doesn't work. Why? Because I'm not immortal and death becomes an issue. I'm not the source of meaning for the world. There has to be more. We sense that there's more. Taylor's main thesis is that no matter how much you believe in the secular order, particularly the secular two order, there's always this nagging voice that says there's got to be something more. There's got to be something more. And as Orthodox Christians, we know what that something more is, and yet we still have absorbed some of this stuff from our culture in terms of reducing our idea of what it means to be a faithful Christian and to have the orientation towards the kingdom of God be the motivation for all of our action in all things. I'm going to ask some questions at the end of class tonight to help us just wrestle with that more, because that's really the idea. Let me just read a little section here, because I think this is really important. Talking about the way that this all creates tensions in the sexual order of things. He's saying that these tensions were already evident before the mid-20th century, the decline in male practice in relation to females from the late 18th century on, relating to the church, okay? One common explanation I mentioned there invoked images of male pride and dignity, but we might also come at the same phenomenon from another direction, stressing that this more rigid sexual code frontally attacked certain male practices, particularly the rowdy lifestyle of young men. And perhaps more profoundly, it seems that the combination of sexual repression and clerical control, as it was felt in the practice of confession, drove men away. Clerical control went against their sense of independence. But this became doubly intolerable when the control took the form of opening up the most reserved and intimate facet of their lives. In other words, the expectation of confession, especially around sexuality, was considered really intrusive. Hence, the immense resistance to confession at just about any period, and the attempt to confess, if one had to, not to one's own priest, but to a visiting priest on mission to whom one was unknown. In other words, you don't want your priest to know what you're struggling with. You want some other priest who's not going to see you ever again. You get your absolution and you're good, right? Eventually, this tension drove men out of the confessional. And this is a quote from a scholar named Gibson, describes the sequel in the 19th century. Quote, "Unable to take communion and angry at the prying of the clergy, they increasingly abandoned the church." Right? So it's as if all these changes had given them a new sense of empowerment, a new sense of freedom that the church was just against completely and overwhelmingly on the sexual side while ignoring other things. So there's a lot that can be, unpacked additionally there, but it helps describe the conditions that then lead up to the outbreak of the sexual revolution, which wasn't so much the sexual revolution for men as it was the sexual revolution for women, right? The 1960s begin a sexual explosion of behavior and activity that gives women the impression this is the way you have power, this is the way you enjoy life, this is the good life, to desire and to be desired. in the body and in sexual behavior. So he talks a lot about this. Again, get the book. If you're interested in these things and this sounds very interesting, please read the book. It's very, very much well worth it. But these are some of the things that are underlying a lot of what's going on here. Now, I want to sort of give some concluding statements here, and let me see if I can, oh, here we are. Taylor seems to himself to get to the end, and it's so frustrating because he talks about so many things, and I'd love to bring them all into our time, and we can't because it's such a big book. But he comes to basically two ideas of where do we go from here? What's happening in the world? Because he's charting these kinds of forces and the way they influence our life and the way that we experience faith, all the way up to his present at the time of this book. And I think this was published in 2012, I believe. Let me see, get that right. 2007, a little bit earlier than 2012, in 2007. So here's what he says. Here's the first point about where is this going. In societies where the general equilibrium point is firmly within immanence, meaning secularized societies like our own, where many people even have trouble understanding how a sane person could believe in God, the dominant secularization narrative, which tends to blame our religious past for many of the woes of our world, all of that will become less plausible over time. This will happen in part because it will be clear that other societies are not following suit, and thus that this master narrative isn't about universal humanity, and also because many of the ills for which religion was supposedly responsible aren't going away. So let me clarify what he is saying there. That the dominant narrative of the secular world, that religion was, you've all probably heard this, religion was responsible for all the wars of the past. Religion does nothing but cause people to kill one another, right? Historically, this is absolute hogwash. Absolute hogwash. It is one of the least understood aspects. People throw that out there, modern day scholars will throw that out there as a given. Everyone's just supposed to believe, yeah, religion causes people to kill each other. That's what it does. It's not true. But what he's saying is the dominant secularization narrative itself will become less plausible over time because we'll start to notice that other parts of the world aren't jumping in. They're not following suit. That this isn't really a narrative of fullness. It's not a narrative that encompasses the globe. Other people will come up with different permutations of living. All right, and a perfect example of this is what has happened in Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. Many of you are old enough to remember that we all thought in the early 90s that Russia was simply going to become a liberal democracy with capitalism, right? That the whole reason they abandoned Marxism, they abandoned communism, was to be just like us. We won, and therefore our way of life is the way of life everybody wants. Whoops. That turns out not to be true. This was the central thesis of Francis Fukuyama, another scholar who declared the end of the Cold War as the end of history. I think we've talked about this before, that basically secular global capitalist democracy was the winning hand in civilization, and that the whole globe would all join in, right? Didn't happen in Russia. They found a different way. They suffered through what was called economic shock therapy, which was a way of forcing them into a capitalist system very, very rapidly, so they didn't have a chance to go back to communism, but caused great suffering amongst the Russian people, spurned the oligarchs, and it's not until Putin that you have a reining in of the oligarchs' power and a reestablishing of order, and suddenly an explosion of what? Orthodox Christianity, this incredibly pre-modern, positively medieval, even ancient religion that had never gone through the Enlightenment, that had never gone through the Renaissance, that didn't understand humanism, that didn't understand all the values of modern neoliberal capitalism, That's what now is the dominant force once again in Russia. Surprised everybody, right? So that erodes the confidence that secularism is the answer to everything. China, the same thing. They have found a solution not in democracy, but in a kind of authoritarian capitalism. Think about how wrong we were about the Arab Spring. We've got to go support all these uprisings in the Middle East because the Arab Spring is happening. And what does the Arab Spring mean? Everybody in the world wants to be just like us. They want to be secular. They want to have individualistic freedom to do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt somebody else. They want more money and more stuff to live a more comfortable life. Didn't happen, right? That's not really how things played out. That was the narrative that we used to tell ourselves we're doing okay over there, but it didn't happen. So what Taylor is saying is that this narrative simply begins to fall apart because we realize it's not applicable to the globe. All right, so that's one thing, and I definitely think that we've seen that. When we talk about, last week I asked if, how confident are we that we're moving in the right direction as a sort of cultural civilization? And a lot of young people now are really angry at their own country. They're really angry because they don't feel that we have any cultural values other than money. Right? That's the only thing we really seem to care about is money. As long as the economy is strong, nothing else matters, right? And it's not enough. You've got to live for something more than money, unfortunately. Fortunately, I suppose. And he says as well, of course, the plausibility of the narrative can be sustained, the narrative of secularism can be sustained by stigmatizing the religious societies as hostile to modern values, right? So that's what we've seen in Russia especially. Look at how the media has treated a Russian doubling down on traditional Orthodox teachings about sexuality, right? They've crucified Russia once again in the media for daring to promote other values. Many Europeans do this with the United States. They think we're nuts, right? We're a much more religious society than Europe is. We're always about at least, there's a sort of an equation here. Wherever Europe is, New York and Los Angeles are about 20 years behind them. And then you can kind of look at other major cities and say that those cities are sort of 20 years behind New York and Los Angeles, and on and on and on. And so you see how segmented and disrupted our society is. Europe is in a much, much deeper state of secularism, and Taylor knows this. Canada as well. I mean, Canada is much, much more secular than the United States. And those folks tend to look at us like, wow, they are a bunch of religious whack jobs, right? They are nuts with everything that they think. They think the same thing towards Islam, I certainly have experienced this coming from the Deep South back to Pittsburgh. We are much more secular in Pittsburgh than the Deep South in East Texas, for sure. Much, much more, in a lot of ways that Taylor is describing. But one narrative says, well, just wait 20 years, East Texas will be like Pittsburgh. And then, Pittsburgh will be like New York in 20 years, and New York will be more like Europe in 20 years, et cetera, et cetera. So it all sort of goes that way. So, but Taylor thinks unless we sink to a real clash of civilizations, this way of lending plausibility to the secularization narrative will give out sooner or later. In other words, what he has really endeavored to show us is that the secular world, the industrial technological revolutions, the shift from a communal mindset to an individualistic mindset, from Christian sacred order to individualistic freedom to chase after the passions and do everything you want. These aren't simply the way things are. These have been constructed intentionally, or in some cases unintentionally, or were unintended consequences to other philosophical movements, but that'll come to an end because it's not a full way of living, and something else will emerge. We don't know what that is. He does sort of talk about this in another section. I won't go into that, but that's one sort of idea of what we're facing. Then he says this, at the same time, this heavy concentration of the atmosphere of imminence will intensify a sense of living in a wasteland for subsequent generations, and many young people will begin again to explore beyond the boundaries. Where this will lead, no one can predict. Right? In other words, those of us who were brought up in really a different era and became adults when much of what we would think of as Christendom was still very much intact, really we're living on the echoes of that world. We don't necessarily feel that our world has changed all that much. And, you get your education, you do your job, you have your kids, you have a nice family, and that's life. And you support your local teams, and you vote in your elections, and what more is there to life? And you go to church, and hopefully that covers you. Again, it gets to that minimalistic idea. Many of us who grew up in a different era will kind of go on feeling like things are okay, but younger people will begin to feel that they live in a wasteland. Well, I think that's obvious. Just look. Just pay attention to where young people are today. And the statistics, the statistics for young people today, if you're in your 20s and you didn't marry somebody that you met in college, your ability to meet somebody today, and especially since COVID happened, has just gone off a cliff. We have eliminated all of our capacity to meet other people. And you talk to anyone in their 20s, they could tell you. You don't need to hear it from me. Just talk to anyone in their 20s. The primary way everyone in their 20s is trying to meet a spouse is through dating apps. And it is an absolute travesty because they feel like they have nothing else in this world, no common bond with anything or anybody to actually connect. And so we're in a crisis of isolation, a crisis of connection. That's the kind of wasteland that I think Taylor is foreseeing in 2007. It's much worse today than it was in 2007. Again, if you're from a different generation, you might have impatience. Oh, these kids, they just don't understand what life is. But I'm telling you, there have been profound changes. And here I want to shift to Smith. And remember, Smith is the book that's sort of our reader's guide to Taylor. He tries to make this larger book more accessible. He offers his own sort of futures, his own sort of addendums. Those were two. One is that the dominant secularization narrative peters out as we realize it's not full, it's not global, it's not going everywhere. Two, young people realize they live in a wasteland and they're looking for something more. Smith offers this. He says, those evangelicals who have been raised and shaped by forms of Christianity that are roughly fundamentalist, and this is kind of the audience that he's talking to, will either, A, become taken with the modern moral order and thus sort of replay the excarnational development of modernity, just now a few centuries later, sort of catching up with the wider culture. So under the guise of the emerging church or progressive evangelicalism, we'll be set on a path to something like Protestant liberalism or a new deism. So that's one sort of pessimistic idea, that those who are Protestant conservative evangelicals in America will just sort of give up, right? That the modern moral order with its pleasure focus and its self-empowerment, they'll sort of just go with it into a kind of liberal Protestantism. Or he offers another option, and I think in some ways it's the option that's most relevant to us. Or these same evangelicals, or some other evangelicals, will recognize the disenchantment and excarnation of evangelical Protestantism and also reject the Christianized subtraction stories of liberal Christianity and feel the pull of more incarnational spiritualities and thus move toward more Catholic expressions of faith. And these expressions of faith will actually exert more pull on those who have doubts about their closed take on the immanent frame. In other words, recognizing the failure, they will move towards orthodoxy. I'm putting words in his mouth. He puts Catholic with a capital C enclosed. He himself is not a Catholic, and I don't think he wants that, but he does see that as people will move towards the incarnational, the whole and the full, the sacramental in a new way. And he says also this above, and I think this is just this is the last paragraph of his book. The aridity of the wasteland that young people find themselves, coupled with the persistent pressure of transcendence that cannot be explained away, will continue to generate third ways of various sorts. In that cross-pressured space, some will begin to feel and be honest about the paucity of a closed take. And in ways that they never could have anticipated, some will begin to wonder if renunciation isn't the way to wholeness, and that freedom might be found in the gift of constraint, and that the strange rituals of Christian worship are the answer to their most human aspirations, as if for their whole lives they've been waiting for, and he uses St. Francis, let's say St. Seraphim of Sarov for ourselves, that the holiness of the saints is what they've always wanted, that is true freedom, that is true liberty. And that seems to be, I think, the underlying sense of both Taylor. Taylor does talk about orthodoxy in his book. I don't think that he appreciates just how different orthodoxy is from Roman Catholicism, particularly a modernized Roman Catholicism. Smith is also aware of orthodoxy, but they both seem to be moving towards this conclusion that explains to some degree why our own membership is changing, why you've got churches throughout the West and the South with 50 catechumens, and they're all young people, right? They're all in their 20s and 30s. They've turned their backs on the secular world. They've recognized how empty and meaningless it is, and they want orthodoxy. They don't want a minimalized orthodoxy. They don't want, curb your enthusiasm, don't be too excited about this. We've been Orthodox our whole lives. It's no big deal. It is a big deal because the rest of the world is starving for what we take for granted, which means that part of what we're called to, and I think part of the conclusion of this, is that our mission remains to enchant the world, to be this open door of paradise where the angels sing and where we are united to Christ in the strange rituals of ancient Christian worship, where we have refused to modernize our theology. We have refused to change our moral teaching. We've refused to say, we've got to keep up with the world and we've got to change everything in order to meet people where they are and then throw out the baby with the bathwater, which is what has happened in Western Christianity. And they're finding it here. And that is the exciting moment we're living in, because I think it's just the beginning. This isn't something that we can it's not like, this has happened and now we're looking back. We're already in this transition where people are looking for this strong thing. I think the scary thing is that they will also be looking for increasingly chaotic things. They will find meaning in chaos. But we have to stand where we are as Orthodox Christians and really, really understand what we're called to. So I want to emphasize this. On the one hand, our mission is being the fullness that is lacking in the modern moral order, of being a fullness of life that you cannot find in the secularized, immanent world, where all you have to do is chase your own passions and make your own way and speak your own truth and pull meaning out of a hat because it's nowhere else to be found. Right? That's a false enchantment. And the reference to pulling out of a hat is intended there. Right? That's a false enchantment. That's an illusion. It's an illusion. But orthodoxy is not an illusion. Orthodoxy is not, I've heard people say, the Orthodox, they haven't been relevant for centuries, right? What do they mean? They're not modern. They haven't changed with the times. They don't get it, man, right? They don't understand. Sometimes we've played with this, and you see this. This is what I'm about to say might consider, I don't mean to be critical for anyone here, but, um, you know, one of the questions you have to ask is, what role does worship play in our lives? And one of the ways that the Orthodox Church has, in modern times, attempted to play around with this idea of modernizing our liturgy is the whole idea of taking a feast day on a weekday and turning it into a vesperal liturgy. Right? You're all aware of this. There are parishes in our diocese that do this. I'm not criticizing that. The bishop has blessed it. Fine. It's an example of saying something like this. People work. People go to church, to school. They don't have time for prayer and worship in the morning. So a little bit at night is better than the full cycle, the way that it's been given to us. We need to adapt the church's structures to meet people where they are so that they can get more, right? Hard to argue with that logic, but there's a slippery slope there, because where are you taking your orders from? Work comes first. And the church is therefore saying, hey, we're not going to mess with your work. We're just the church. Don't mind us. We'll make it convenient for you, because worship is really all about you, isn't it? That's essentially what the modern moral order has done in the Protestant churches, and I would argue even in the Catholic Church. Increasingly, worship is really about you. It's not about the one who sits on the throne of glory. And that's the whole problem, and you can feel it. And I can't tell you how many young converts have told this to me. They go to other churches and they just feel like it's no different than going to any kind of concert or even in a Roman Catholic Mass. It's just not, there's something off about the Spirit. But you come into an Orthodox church and you feel that it's about God. Not the God who is way up there beyond the cosmos that we're hoping our prayers reach up to him, but the God who's here and all the iconography of the temple proclaiming that he's here. You feel it. That's the pull. That's what they're looking for. So this is crucial. We are the fullness that is so lacking in the modern moral order, and we have to call ourselves and those led to us to this transcendence without apology and with great courage. We have got to overcome our echo of this kind of moralistic church as civilizational value. Just be a good person, show up, put your money in the plate, you're good to go, you've met the minimum, right? One confession a year, one communion a year, you've got your money, you're a member, you're good. That's it. That's the whole mindset, right? We've got to shed that and recognize that we are the bearers of a tradition that comes from a different place. It comes from heaven itself. And our worship is not only pre-modern, I would say that our fundamental attitude about worship stretches 3,500 years all the way back to the tabernacle, right? Sometimes we say, oh, we haven't changed since the 4th century, or from the beginning, Orthodox worship is the way Christians have always done it. Really, though, our whole framework comes to us from the tabernacle itself, and that's 3,500 years old. And you can feel it. It matters. It matters. So we've got to call ourselves to that, and we've got to recognize that we have been given so many gifts to make sure that the motive and action of our lives is directed towards the Lord. And that doesn't matter what our job is. I mean, it might matter. I'll come to that in a moment. But really, the idea, and I've kind of wondered if anyone was going to ask this, and nobody has, but are we going to get to a point in this class where we hear, okay, folks, let's buy some land and set up an Orthodox Christian commune, and let's protect our children from the evils of the modern world, and we're going to retreat into our little ghetto and have worship and live like it's the 17th century or something like that. Interestingly, that is not Taylor's agenda at all. There have been people who have suggested things like that. Some of you probably have heard of a book called The Benedict Option by conservative commentator and Orthodox Christian Rod Dreher. Anyone know Rod Dreher or know of Rod Dreher? He wrote for many years for the Christian Conservative. No. what was the, never mind. An online magazine that he became very well known for, and he's written several books. One is The Benedict Option. I've not read it, so I won't comment on it because I'm sure I misunderstand it. But it's the idea of withdrawal. We've got, if the society has rejected our values, we have to ourselves retreat from the society to some level. Taylor's not suggesting that, and I'm not suggesting that. The church is called to be missionary to whatever condition it finds, whether that's the persecuting Roman Empire or the flattened, imminent, aggressively secularized world we find ourselves. We are to be the leaven that enchants and sacralizes that world. We're not called to retreat from it and say, you guys are no good for us, right? And that's the temptation. That's not what we're called to do. We're called to mission, not retreat. We're called to advance, not run away. And that's really, really important. So I think that those two things, our mission as a church and our mission to ourselves and to all whom the Lord brings to us, is crucial in terms of understanding why they're coming. And if for no other reason that we've talked about this book now for 6 weeks, is for us to begin to understand, it's a reaction against a world of no meaning and no purpose, where just, getting a job and buying a new Nintendo every 2 years is not really that satisfying, right? But that's what we're told. Wouldn't it be great? Get a new TV every 2 years, new computer every 2 years, new game console every 2 years, lease a car so you get the newest model, every 2 or 3 years. You're always feeding your needs with things that you're buying on credit, and we're sick of it. And the world is sick of it. And that's where we have to stand in our mission. I want to ask just a few concluding questions, and these are, ways for us to think about this more for ourselves. Does pursuing things of secular value make it hard for me to pray? Or another way of putting that, is it hard? Do I find it hard to pray because I can't stop thinking of worldly matters or the ordinary worldly aspects of human flourishing, right? Am I caught up in the anxiety of work and identity through work and identity through activity that I can't pray? How does my secularism impinge upon my ability to give myself over to prayer? Because we are called to be priests, and priests pray, and they know how to pray, and priests make sacrifice, and they know how to sacrifice. The baptismal font made every one of us a priest of Christ's kingdom and a kingdom of priests. Do we know how to pray? And is our secular lifestyle making that really, really hard for us? That's just a simple question, and it's not, there's no answer to it except what's going on in your heart right now and what's going on in my heart, because I can tell you by thinking about these things, even as an Orthodox priest who dresses medievally, right, as a medieval, this old style, I'm still very much influenced by the secular air that we breathe, and it affects my ability to pray. But I have to find out for me what that means, and then ask, am I willing to make changes? Am I going to turn off the TV a little bit earlier at night? Am I going to stop doom scrolling through my phone, right? Try to pray when you're caught up in the doom scrolling cycle. Thank God for some of you who don't know what that is and have never experienced it. Congratulations. But for many young people, it's, 6 hours in the phone. Try to pray after spending 6 hours in your phone. It doesn't work very well. And you can't think of the words of the prayer because you're frazzled, right? All the screen and the electricity, it's frazzled your brain, it's frazzled your soul and your perspective. You can't do it. So you have a question. Maybe if I'm called to pray, then maybe I need to put this stuff aside. Here's another one. This is totally on me as well. I'm going to be a little bit self-revealing here. What do I want to do when I go on vacation? Think of that as just an existential revelation of the kind of mindset that we have. What do I want to do on vacation? What is restful? I grew up What is vacation? Going to the beach, right? And what do you do at the beach? You do nothing. You sit on the beach and you do nothing because you need to rest from this crazed world of work and school and all of its demands, right? Vacation is all about me time. And I have to confess that when I think about vacation, my first thought goes to me time, to just resting on the beach or just doing something else. But I think that the real essence of travel and vacation originates in pilgrimage. And pilgrimage was a leaving of your normal place of living and working and being and traveling somewhere else. Oftentimes this meant walking in the medieval world, walking somewhere else, but for a very specific spiritual purpose. And that was considered to be restful. That was considered to be the break that you needed from the pressures of the imminent world. What's a great vacation? Can we incorporate pilgrimage into our ideas of travel and rest? What would that mean? Okay, another open question. Here's another big one. Madhushka and I have been hit with this recently. What do you want to do when you retire? Some of you are in retirement, so this will be different. And it's, again, I'm not trying to criticize anybody's choices. Some people might say, hey, I worked hard. I want to enjoy the fruits of my labor. I want to go play golf 6 days a week. I want to sit at the pool and drink pina coladas. I want to watch movies and read some books. And that's what I want to do in retirement. Okay, our society sort of rewards that idea that you would get to retirement and you would retreat from everybody else that you knew and just live your own indulgent life. And that's, yeah, it's becoming harder. Yeah. Yeah. It's becoming harder, that's for sure. And a lot of people are staying where they were in retirement now compared to time to move to Florida. Oh, good luck with that, right? You'll be running away every six weeks from hurricanes. But what do I want to do? So this is a question. It's very existential. What is the good life in retirement? So we had, Madhushka and I are working with someone who was asking us this for financial reasons, and we had to think about it like, gosh, we want to live, like what we really want is to have like a small cottage close enough to a monastery or a church that had daily services that we could just go to church every day. Get up and say, like, I'm not getting up to go to work. It's not work that defines me, although for me, work is, it's a little different for me. But, but what do we want to do? We want to go to church every day. We want to garden. We want to hike. We want to read. We want to be in a community where we're connected with other Orthodox Christians. And, to a financial planner, that just like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? You're supposed to tell how you want like 2 or 3 homes and you want this and you want to travel and you want to do all these things. Yeah, we want to travel too. That's great. And sure, we want to pay attention to where our kids are and if there's grandkids, where are they? That all matters. But really, what do we want? We want to pray. We want to be in worship. And one of the things I've had to struggle with then is, well, what is the worshiping life of the church on a day-to-day basis? It wasn't that long ago where daily divine services were the norm for churches. Notice how this secularized idea of what life is and what is good has impacted our church to the extent that for really the last couple hundred years probably, or at least 130 years, this idea of Sunday-only Christianity, Sunday-only liturgy, has been our sense of, well, that's enough because we got other things to do. But why shouldn't there be daily matins at the church? Why shouldn't there be daily vespers at the church? Well, because people have to work. How are they going to come to that? And they live far enough away from the church. So that becomes another question. If you are in a position where you have to move, are you going to move, or what are the criteria for where you're going to move? Are you going to move in such a way that you could go to church every day? If church is far away, you won't do it. You might tell yourself you want to do it. You might tell yourself you should do it, but you won't do it, right? It's structural if we don't actually make decisions this way. This is the phenomenon that's going on in Florence, Arizona. Florence, Arizona is where St. Anthony's Monastery is, and the whole town is being bought up by people who have moved to be close to the monastery so they can go to daily divine services there. Now, I can tell you, that doesn't appeal that much to me because their morning service starts at 2 a.m., and I really am quite sure I don't mind visiting that monastery every few years and doing that a couple of nights, mornings, but do I want to live every day getting up at 1 in the morning to go to church from 2 to 5? There are people doing it. That's the key. There are people doing it. Maybe I'm just too weak to imagine myself doing that. I mean, sleep is an issue for me, right? I'm not someone who can just change my sleep patterns easily. But all of these are questions to ask ourselves. What is the norm for a church? Why don't we have more services? Do we define the success of service by the number of people who can attend? Or do we simply understand that the church is engaged in the enchanting of the world, which means we get here and we chant. We come here and we pray, and this has an impact on the world that we live in. One of the prayers that the priests read in the prayers of light for Vespers, and we just did it tonight. I don't have it right before me, so I'll just paraphrase, but basically there's a prayer that says that it's asking the Lord to raise us up and essentially deal with my own sins, and this is the priest, in priest's words, my own sins and the sins of the people. In other words, the priest is supposed to pray in such a way that he's dealing with his own sins and he's bringing relief to the sins of the people. He's bearing the sins of the people as Christ himself bore the sins of the world on the cross. Do I understand that dynamic, that when we pray, we're taking up the world and we're lifting it to God? And that's true whether there's 3 people here or 30 people here or 300 people here. That fact isn't impacted by the attendance. But that's just another secular inroad to the church where we say, oh, no reason to have church. Not many people could come anyway, right? Because after all, isn't it all about you? That's the reductive logic of that way of thinking. But it's very seductive. Yes, Olga? Yeah. Right. Yeah. So for people who didn't hear that, you know how the Catholic Church will have 5 or 6 masses a day that's tailored towards people's different schedules. And of course, many Roman Catholics just go to the 5 o'clock Saturday night Mass, and that serves as the minimum obligation that they are required to maintain their membership in the church. This gets back to what we were saying about the Catholic Reformation in France. What's the minimum I have to do, right? It's more convenient for you. You can still go out to dinner and go to a show on Saturday night, sleep in on Sunday morning, but hey, you had the Eucharist. You got yourself to the Mass at 5 o'clock. Obviously, we don't do that in the Orthodox Church because this is another incredibly ancient thing that we insist upon, that there is one faith and one body, and the Eucharist is one and makes us one. And we don't have time to do this tonight. I was going to look at the degree to which we as Orthodox Christians interpret a lot of our own tradition as individuals when our tradition is speaking a communal language to us. That would be, hopefully I'll find a way to slip that in future sessions. But yes, Mariska. Mm-hmm. Right, right.
Over there, every church just about is an Orthodox.
Yeah, yeah.
From the place you go to work to your apartment going home, you probably pass 2 or 3 or 4.
Right.
Some people coming in after work, praying, the services are going on constantly.
Yeah.
They're there for as long as they can, light their candles, say their prayers.
Right.
Keep on going.
Right,
So,
yeah.
We're seeking the possibility of one church, one priest,
Yeah.
in a 15-mile area.
Right.
But it should be way more difficult than.
Yeah, for sure. Or at least in the sense that it's impossible to expect people to drive a half an hour to go to church 8 times a week. You know what I mean? Like that's what I mean if you don't live close enough. But, here's another thing. Pittsburgh is much better on this measure than, say, any church, any city in the South, where you might have a city the size of Dallas and have 5 parishes there, 5 Orthodox parishes, right? Dallas is gigantic. Houston is gigantic compared to Pittsburgh. And they have maybe a 10th of the number of parishes. So imagine how hard that is. For many of us, we do drive past other Orthodox churches to get here, right? Which is fine. This is your church home, and that's good. But what if you were able to go to other churches for weekday services and not feel that was somehow a betrayal? I think we should do that, because that's what happens in Russia. You're on your way to work. You're going to walk past several churches and maybe even a couple monasteries in Moscow. Every day that you're walking to work, you can go into church constantly. You can stay for 10 minutes and then leave. And all of that's okay. It's not a formalized no one's taking attendance when they come. But it's a challenge for us. It's certainly not an easy solution. It's a challenge for us to realize this is the mission. And we are dealing with a lot less than a country like the church in Russia or the church in Greece. Some of that is logistic, for sure. Some of it's because we've just adopted secular modes of thinking about these things, even within our own liturgical, spiritual, ascetical lives. We've said, hey, I'm a secular professional person. I've got to pursue money, and I just don't have time for all that. And that is more seductive than we care to admit to ourselves. Yeah, that was the last question I have. How often should the church have services? What is the point if lots of people can't come? But of course, that is the point, that the church prays and the world turns because of that, and the cross stands. I'll give you one last image, and then we need to close for the night. There's a monk on Mount Athos who asked a demon, what are the demons most afraid of? And the demon said, they're most afraid of the thing that Christians wear around their necks, meaning crosses, right? They're afraid of the water of baptism, and they're afraid of the Eucharist. Those are the 3 things that the demons flee from. And I think what's really beautiful about that sort of revelation is that it doesn't mean that the cross is a magical talisman and all you have to do to protect yourselves from vampires, for instance, is to wield a cross. It's not just the cross. It is the cross itself, but it's the crucified life that they can't stand and they can't be near. It burns them. It's not just, it is the water of baptism, but it's the purity of the Christian soul and heart that emerges from the baptismal font, which is the constant renewal in confession. The real connection of confession to our lives is our baptisms. It's not the gateway to communion. It is that too. But it really is the renewal of the purity of the baptismal font. That's what the demons can't stand. And it is the Eucharist itself, the physical aspect of the Eucharist, but it is the Eucharistic life of the Christian that the demons can't stand. And this is part of this enchanted order, if we use that word very carefully, part of this understanding that there are unseen things that are opposed to us, but even more powerful unseen things that we are called to embody and to bear to the world, and the darkness flees. And that's our mission, to take up those things not as talismans, but as our very way of life. All right. We're going to stop there. Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I wish we were spending more time with you, but we got to move on because we could just, we could go on for years. We're going to take next week off, so no class next week. I just need a little bit more time to structure our approach to McGilchrist, which it's a massive project that he did. He's known as a polymath. Does everyone know what a polymath is? Yeah, polymath is someone who knows everything about everything. If you look at the bibliography of his books, it is just mind-boggling how much this guy has read. He is truly, truly a gifted scholar. And he's really been making the rounds on interview shows and YouTube, and so I will be sending out links to some of his videos. He is interesting. Taylor was a Catholic, is a Catholic, still writing. McGilchrist considers himself agnostic. But the first video I'm going to send out to sort of introduce him and let him, in his own words, encapsulate what his whole research has been about over the last decade. In that video, he says something very striking about attending an Orthodox service in Russia. A long time ago, it was actually still during the Soviet Union. He was in Russia and he went into an Orthodox church. And he says something about that, that experience is really, really neat. So I'll send you that video at some point once we get started. But we're going to take next week off. This has been What is Good. Next is what is true and what are the ways to truth. And how do those two things then intersect as we understand them as Orthodox Christians. Okay, good night.